But I think, using the examples we do have, we can show that rumours particularly travelled outside the capitals wherever emperors happened to be living. Gossip, not so much. Gossip, or at least our sources for gossip, are really placed firmly in the cities. There are some examples outside them, but I couldn't find wide circulation of gossip, which perhaps tells us something about, rumors about, taxes, about warfare, about deaths, they're the things that matter far and wide. Perhaps people in Britain, didn't really care whether the emperor was bald. They never saw him except on the coins. But, the fact that they, may be required to pay, higher taxes because of invasions, that's something that would matter empire-wide.
Hello, I'm Zeb Links, editor at Aspects of History. Rumours whispered in the forum, graffiti scrawled on walls, and scandalous tales passed between senator and citizen. The Roman emperor was as much a manifestation of gossip as of power. But how far can we trust these tales, and what do they reveal about the imperial system itself? Joining me on the podcast today is Caillan Davenport, professor and historian whose study, Behind Caesar's Back, offers a bold, fresh approach to imperial Rome. Moving beyond traditional biographies, his sweeping study reconstructs the oral world of the Roman Empire, sharing insight into political talk, public opinion, and the delicate relationship between ruler and ruled. Next week, Damian Lewis joins Phil Craig to uncover more extraordinary true stories of escape, survival, and audacity. From the Sahara to the Vatican, drawing on letters, diaries, and first-hand accounts, this will be another thrilling look at the courage, daring, and resilience behind SAS maneuvers. But for now, sit back and enjoy my conversation with Caillan Davenport. Hi, Caillan. Many thanks for joining us on the Aspects of History podcast. A real pleasure to have you call in from Australia.
Thank you so much for having me.
So, Behind Caesar's Back, Rumour, Gossip, and the Making of the Roman Emperors was released under the Yale University Press aegis earlier this year. I'd say it's a must-read for ancient historians. It's full of insight, anecdotes, tales of various dynasties and centuries that many won't have heard. And it really gets to grips with so much of what we arguably miss if we focus too much on the written historiography. So what were the seeds of this effort to get to grips with the Caesar using such a novel approach?
I think it started from my teaching originally, teaching courses on the Roman Empire. And you find that the same stories about Roman emperors are told again and again. So there's various groups of stories about young emperors roaming the streets in disguise, for example, that are told all the way from the 1st century CE to the 4th century CE. And, this raises the question, did this really happen, or is this just an example of how people thought emperors behaved, or how they thought young emperors behaved? And that got me thinking that maybe we shouldn't necessarily take a biographical approach to the Roman emperors. Of course, I think virtually every emperor who reigned for at least 5 years has a biography of some sort, and you can write really excellent biographies of people like Julian and Marcus Aurelius. But it got me thinking that what if we looked at the Roman emperor as a figure over time and looked at these stories as an example of how people thought about their emperors rather than what they actually did.
Yeah, and you begin with a clear differentiation of the definitions of rumour and gossip, both of them forms of everyday politics. But they're two words that maybe today one might consider synonymous. But if you care to explain, there is an important nuance for readers to consider here, one that kind of grounds the book and your method of investigation.
Yeah, that's exactly right. So yeah, today we just treat them as synonyms. We say we spread rumors about colleagues, or and we gossip about colleagues in the same way. But actually, sociologically, they have quite different definitions. So rumor is really a sense making exercise. So it's an attempt to work out what is happening when we don't have enough information about what's going on, or we don't believe the information that we receive. So, it could be about modern day politics, for example. The one example I use in the book is the beginning of COVID. There were all these rumors about how it started because, many people didn't believe that it could just start spontaneously. They were looking for conspiracy theories, it's escaping from a lab, etc. And we spread rumors about politicians today because we don't know what they're thinking. We don't know what is going on in Donald Trump's head or in his cabinet room, for example. So we try and explain what is going on through sort of our understanding of events, so of our understanding of how people behave, what we think rulers are like, what we think motivates them, and very often these are stereotypical prejudices, but they're really rooted to how rumors develop and spread. You don't spread rumors that you don't believe, at least in some form, and that's actually what gives rumors their power, because people believe them. Gossip is a bit different. Gossip is what you might call evaluative social talk. So it's assessing the character and behavior of other individuals. And, we all do it. It's a form of sort of social bonding, but it's also a way to articulate the values and morals of particular groups. And, a gossip can be about people's appearance, whether they've put on weight or not, whether they've dyed their hair, and it can, could go quite, to people's affairs, their love life. And, as we're spreading that gossip, we're passing judgment on them. So if we're gossiping about a colleague that's having an affair, we're sort of passing judgment on them that they should not be doing that. So, there is this sense that gossip binds us together, but there's also the senses that we use it to pass judgment.
Yeah, it's really fascinating to kind of dissect it like that. The vignette at the beginning, you had the boys singing the graffiti describing Nero, his death, and the various colourful tales around his rule. Set that scene for us and introduce us to some of the themes of the book.
Yeah, so I start off by sort of bringing together graffiti from Pompeii with some of the rhymes which people sang in the ancient world, and this is a way to sort of decenter, traditional ancient sources, the annals of Tacitus, for example, the biographies of Suetonius, which do contain gossip and rumor, but I really want to unveil a range of other sources that we can use. So it's not just, retelling gossip and rumor through the eyes of Tacitus and Suetonius, who are literally authors with their own agenda. So, there are all these sort of graffiti throughout Pompeii, some of which are praising Nero and Pompeii because they've restored the games. But there's also these graffiti which talk about, Nero as a poisoner. And that's really interesting because we do find that in Suetonius and Tacitus, but to find it on the walls of Pompeii shows that, people outside the capital, outside the court, are talking about that. And I sort of, combine this with sort of popular rhymes about kingship and how kings are supposed to behave, how kings are supposed to be just and follow the laws and supposed to be merciful, with the fact that very often kings did not behave like that, and Nero certainly didn't behave like that. So I think if we can put together graffiti, letters of papyri, letters that exchange between bishops, sermons as well for the later Roman Empire, we can try and sort of reconstruct this sort of what I call the oral discourse, that, the way in which people exchanged rumor and gossip, the way they talked about Roman emperors. We can't go back and interview them, but our sources really do reveal that orality was a key way of negotiating power.
And we begin with the various talk of what an emperor could possibly do to or for a populace, whether that's affecting citizens, inhabitants in kind of legal, fiscal spheres, or issues like taxation, supplies of grain, matters of faith. Does it work both ways? And can a Caesar be rumored to be affecting benefits as much as he is discussed inflicting punishments or ills?
Yeah, that's a really interesting question. So, quite often they are about the negative things that people fear from their emperor. The idea that he commands a huge army, and that he could mete out punishment to the populace as well. So a lot of these rumors are sort of feared based, but there are sometimes some hopeful rumors. Particularly if an emperor who isn't liked, is rumored to be on his deathbed, that can be hopeful. The sense that regime change can bring benefits. There are rumors that associated with deaths, and then people are going to be released from prison, for example. There's going to be amnesties under the new emperor. And this sort of sense that if we have, for example, a young prince, that they are going to be someone who is going to be a good and just ruler. There's this association with youth and goodness. Of course, there's also youth and dissolute nature, but also the sense that that a younger ruler could be a good one as well.
Yeah, the possibilities here. As I thought about you researching a book like this, it kind of struck me just how slippery and elusive rationalizing these tales and the subject matter as a whole must have been. Talk us through some of the challenges involved in the writing of a coherent account in comparison to, as you say, kind of more orthodox historiographical writing.
Yeah, no, that's a really important point, because as I was sort of thinking through the material, I was originally basing it quite heavily on sort of the standard historical narratives, Tacitus, Suetonius, Cassius Dio, Ammianus, Procopius for the later Roman Empire. And of course, you have issues there. You have issues with chronological distance from events in many cases, not all cases. Ammianus was an eyewitness to many of the events he describes. But in many cases, there's that, and, is it necessarily an accurate depiction of a rumor that was circulating, or is it a literary trope to denigrate an emperor? This is a technique that Tacitus uses all the time. Some people said this, but others were hoping that. And, how did he really know what the populace of Rome in the reign of Tiberius, 100 years before his time, was really thinking? And, when I presented some of the early arguments at conferences and universities, that's sort of like the pushback I was getting, is that to what extent are you really accurately capturing rumor and gossip, or are you really just capturing the agendas of these authors? Which is a really good point. So then I really worked very, very hard to firstly narrow down incidents in literary texts that do reveal orality. So, for example, if Suetonius tells us he heard a story from his grandfather, then that is something that has been passed down from generations. And so I looked for a lot of these stories. Cassius Dio says, rumors that he heard from his father. So, looking for verbs of speaking and hearing and records of conversations proved to be really pivotal. With someone like Ammianus, he is a contemporary for a lot of events. He served as a soldier in the Emperor Julian's personal campaign. So, focusing on those events that he witnessed himself, and when he was talking about rumors that he heard himself while on campaign, really giving priority to those stories. So I know I really worked through the literary texts in, a really quite systematic manner, and, was throwing out things that just seemed to be too dubious or where might not have a leg to stand on, to really hone in on these elements. The second aspect in terms of methodologically is, as I said, looking at graffiti, pamphlets that are said to have circulated that are quoted by our literary sources. They quote verses, for example. They quote graffiti, which no longer survives, because they were interested in a popular appraisals of their emperors. So giving priority to these texts, which historians do accept are genuine. And really also, like, the world of late antiquity was really important, to get beyond, the Julio-Claudians, the Flavians, and go all the way up to the 7th century CE, because we have actually a lot more contemporary evidence for rumour and gossip through letters in late antiquity. I mean, there's some in Pliny the Younger, not as much as you'd expect, but all these letters that are being exchanged by senators and by bishops and other clergy in late antiquity, when they're talking about, I heard this in Constantinople, and I heard this from that messenger, etc., that really does provide us sort of with crucial contemporary evidence. The other evidence from late antiquity that's really important is sermons. So, if bishops or priests are talking to their congregations, they often use contemporary anecdotes to elucidate the scriptures, and they would only use these if they were of relevance and of interest to their audience, and this really helped to open up the canvas and be able to sort of trace channels of communication. If someone is delivering a sermon in Antioch that touches on events that are in Constantinople, we are presuming that the rumor has traveled, or rumors are emerging in Antioch because they're trying to make sense of things they have heard. So these were sort of the methodological issues that I confronted, and how I tried to tackle them by really, wherever possible, giving priority to contemporary evidence, or at least making clear the chain of how things passed from contemporaries to later authors.
I mean, I'm going slightly off my own script here. I think that was the thing that it was quite humbling in a way for me, because having done a classics degree, 4 years of it, so little of what I studied kind of related to that later antiquity period. And you've kind of almost answered my next question, which was about the scope of the book and how enormous it is. You cover almost a millennia, and Tacitus, Suetonius, Cassius Dio, as you say, crop up, but so many works of history, and that must have felt like a really monumental kind of wall to hurdle at times. I mean, were there things you've just talked about missing things out, but you feel that you've done it all justice?
Yeah, I mean, I it was many years of research and thinking, and just a lot of time just sort of sitting with texts and taking notes, and just reading complete collections of letters or sermons from cover to cover, and sometimes you would find nothing, like a whole day, nothing in there that's sort of any use. Other time you strike gold and think, oh my goodness, this is amazing, I've got to use this one. And so I essentially built up a database author by author, over time. I was lucky to spend quite a bit of time in Germany on a fellowship devoted to this project as well, which gave me, time really to expand into late antiquity in ways that I hadn't before. And my sponsor on the fellowship, Professor Hartmut Pien, was fantastic. And, he was the one who put me onto sermons and said, you should really look at this as a source of evidence. And then, look, I can't claim to have read every sermon from late antiquity, but I read as many as I could get my hands on. It's same for the other evidence, like letters. I basically build up lists of works that I wanted to read, And I learned so much about so many things I had no idea, about like grain and everything like that, or what people in Antioch or Alexandria were talking about. And yeah, no, it was really sort of exciting opportunity just to read as many texts as possible. And that I think, quite often in classics degrees, we sort of, it's sort of Polybius to Juvenal or something like that, really, in terms of the range that is covered. And, for good reason. They're, really fantastic authors, Cicero, Horace, etc., all within that group. But, late antiquity is also amazing as well. And, can really open up a vista to what is going on in the Roman world. So once I'd collected all those texts, I started categorizing them. So in terms of like the structure of the book and, the way in which, the different chapters deal with topics such as, what an emperor could do, so the possibilities of power, sex, scandal, and satire, so sort of jokes about emperors, his personal life, his behavior, death and dynasty, about rumors about deaths, and then rumored returns about people who come back or thought to have died, but then come back. That really came out of the evidence and sifting through it and thinking, how can I construct a coherent story out of this? And quite early on, the number of rumors about deaths about emperors really loomed large. So I knew that was going to be a key. From my catalogue, and I've read as much as I could, that is the prime preoccupation in terms of emperors is, what's going to happen if they die early, what's going to happen, who's going to continue, are we going to have a war, or that sense also of, yay, he might be on his way out. We might get a better guy replacing him as well. So that's quite important. So, but there were many sort of false starts in terms of how to organize these ideas. And originally there was a chapter sort of just called Laughing at Emperors, but that didn't quite work. Mary Beard's written a great book on Roman laughter, and so I broadened it out to a discussion of various aspects of an emperor's sort of private life and appearance and behavior. And there are rumors that made the cutting room floor, rumor and gossip, it is pretty comprehensive, but, sometimes there's like, bits that, just didn't fit in. And so, just left them out because, it still needs to be a coherent book as well. And, the examples that are in there, do need to make sense in terms of telling stories. So definitely a long but very exciting process of research and writing.
Yeah, arduous academia. There's a precarious tightrope, as you've kind of alluded to walk in terms of kind of rumor and gossip appearing in these works. How do you rationalize the fact that these authors, as you say, they're writing decades, centuries after the fact, and there's that tension between the oral popular origins, which gain momentum and thin out, and then that idea that some reported information is merely hearsay, and you kind of can reach a dead end by tracing it?
Yeah, no, I think that's, it's a challenging prospect. And, so I did sort of throw out or disregard anything that seemed, too speculative when authors are putting their own thoughts into the minds of sort of large groups of people. If someone is saying like the people ran down, the sacred road into the forum and they were all thinking this, and, I can't use that unless the person was there. So Cassius Dio is an eyewitness at some events, when he sees the Senate House being surrounded in AD 193. This is a year where we have 5 emperors, and he's in Rome, so he is an eyewitness. So this is the thing. It's like, were they there? And if they weren't there, how could they have known? So those are the questions that I was always asking myself. And then in the histories, as I alluded to before, there's all these sort of records of chants and verses and songs about emperors, some of which are supposed to have been chanted publicly, others which were written up and posted. And these exist throughout all of Roman history, and they are recorded by the great authors, Suetonius, Procopius, Theophanes, all the way through to the Byzantine period. And of course, there is the question of their accuracy, and I can defend that in the sense that virtually all historians do accept them as accurate records. The better argument, rather than we all think this, is that the meter that they use is the meter of acclamations and chants in the hippodrome. So they actually set in this what's called the versus quadratus, and other meters that people actually used. And so you could then say, well, they're just one very clever author making it up in the right meter. But then we can look at cases where we do have people like Cassius Dio, who says, I was in the Circus Maximus and I heard them chanting this. I suppose an extreme skeptic could then say, well, Cassius Dio could have made that up. But I feel if we go too far down that route, we might as well just give up being historians at all. If we try and, think of as many sort of, as many sort of defenses as we can, as many sort of, ways of showing how this came down to us and it's accurate, then, I think then that is a pretty solid foundation to build on, as opposed to, Tacitus said at the death of Augustus, the people of Rome thought this, which I would not use, except if I was writing a work on, the people in Tacitus's thought or something like that. So I think that way we can do it. And, again, I try not to build too many arguments on that. I was always looking for, okay, Cassius Dio was there, Ammianus was there, Procopius was there, etc., and trying to look for those kind of situations as the main foundations of my argument. And it's up to readers to, that there are places where I'm a bit more speculative, and then it's up to readers to say, well, no, I think you've gone too far. I won't believe that one. But that's up for each reader to judge for themselves.
I was convinced, if it's any consolation.
Oh, thank you.
So throughout the book, you also allude to the importance of these kind of folkloric motifs being echoed in many of the examples of rumours. How significant is that in the understanding of invention and proliferation of the tales? And would you say that folklore is as much a factor in the transmission of rumour today?
Yeah, so rumors only circulate if we believe them, and so they cleave to our preconceptions. The idea that a significant part of the world's population thinks that Donald Trump is short a few marbles, and that's how we judge him. That's how we judge him, because we have that perception of him. That's why, there were these rumors that COVID started, was deliberately engineered by the Chinese. That's based in, racist or other sort of prejudices about China and how they act. So rumors, have to have widespread belief in order to begin, but then also to continue. And so a lot of the stories that are told about emperors, we also find in folklore throughout many cultures, the idea that a son would kill his father in order to become king. The idea that someone may dress up in disguise and go amongst his people to find out what they're saying. That's a very common one. And then we get, folklore about incestuous behavior, about affairs between stepmothers and stepsons, for example. And so when the tales cleave very closely to these sort of stories which are found in many cultures, one has to wonder whether they continue to circulate because they relate so closely to mythology and literature that sort of spreads these ideas. And one thing that was really interesting that I found is that a lot of these folkloric ideas, were not just present amongst the general population. You also found them at court amongst the more educated. The idea that behind every man is a scheming woman, for example, or that the king is good, but his advisors who are wicked, which is a very common folkloric trope. And if we could just get the king himself, then he is if he wasn't as surrounded by all these wicked slaves. So I think today maybe in our contemporary world it's less about folklore, because we're exposed to so many other sources of information. We don't just hear things, the stories that are told to us by our parents or in our communities. We also now have the TV, the internet, the radio, and so we're exposed to many more things beyond these sort of tales. But I think rumour is still very much shaped by our prejudices. And things that we believe to be true. And that's why, there are so many rumors about based on stereotypes of ethnic groups, for example, or stereotypes of gender. And they really actually show also, the nasty side of the human psyche.
Hello, Zeb here. Please forgive my interruption, but I wanted to let you know that at Aspects of History, we produce a digital magazine featuring articles, interviews, short stories, and book reviews of the best historical writing available. Authors featured including Ben McIntyre, Lucy Worsley, Andrew Roberts, and plenty more. An annual subscription is available for only $9.99. That's pounds or dollars. Yep, you heard that right. That's 6 issues for under £10 or dollars. Head over to aspectsofhistory.com to subscribe, where you can also give subscriptions. Now back to the show. Correct me if I'm wrong, but a reader might assume that you feel there is still a kind of bias among ancient historians towards this high form and the canonical texts authored by the elite classes, as opposed to the low, the verse that you mentioned, acclamation, songs, graffiti. Is that a fair assumption? And how do you go about beating this drum to kind of direct mainstream scholarship to the latter?
Yeah, no, it's good. So, I'm a historian. I'm a political historian. So I spent a considerable part of my career writing about the upper classes of Rome, senators and equestrians, and emperors. But I think in order to get a full picture of the political culture of the ancient world, we can't just rely on individuals at court and the upper social spectrum. I think in order to truly understand why the emperor mattered in the popular psyche, and that also, why the imperial system lasted so long as well, I think is really important. And this sort of feeds into debates in Roman history about, the ideas of consensus behind Roman rule, that the benefits and privileges of Roman rule for the upper classes help support the emperors and the imperial system. And there's incredible amount of evidence to recommend that that point of view. But I'm also interested in sort of the messier side, the side of dissent, of questioning. And sometimes, questioning can be allowed because, that actually then supports what's going on. If you just question things but don't actually take action, that shows that in the end of the day, you're not motivated enough in order to revolt. And so, no, I sort of look at different forms of scholarship about how we might conceptualize public opinion in the ancient world, how we might think about public discourse. The fact that people are speaking on the streets, which then leads to chants in the amphitheater or the Circus Maximus, shows that emperors matter, and that their behavior, their policies matter to people. Otherwise, they wouldn't talk about them. And I think, that's why we still talk about politicians today. We can't always take control the way we would like to. I mean, we can vote at the ballot box in democracies. But, that's really not enough. I should say, you can vote people out and vote new ones in, but that's not actually having a real voice. And so I think thinking about debate and politics as something that just doesn't happen, in the Senate or in the court, is really important. I think that offers us sort of a richer view of the Roman world, but also the place of their leaders within it.
So the topics of the gossip become more personal when you approach the sexual stories, particularly of Augustus and his household. Rumours and invective of this kind are kind of not uncommon in even quite the well-known Roman literature, but they can be, still destructive to political careers today. How pernicious were they in imperial Rome?
Yeah, so it's the sex rumors which everyone remembers from Suetonius, for example, and that's what everyone and the gossip as well, I should say. So you can have rumors about people's sex life, who they're having sex with, and why they're doing it, and the explanations. But you can also use it, just to gossip about, denigrate people, and one of the ways to do that in the ancient world was to imply that they were the passive sexual partner with a man or a woman, and so that's evaluating their character and whether they're man enough to rule in the Roman mindset. I should emphasize. So, obviously everyone remembers these, from their, high school or university, reading of Suetonius. But I think there's something more to them. And, yes, they're very rude and in many cases quite funny. But, they also suggest that who the emperor has sex with matters, and whether it is going to produce an heir or not, as the case may be, whether it's going to produce multiple heirs, whether he's having sex in the correct way that Romans think about it, all the way through to where he has hair on his body and what animal he might be compared to. The idea that if he's balding but has a hairy chest, he's like a goat, and goats are sexually deviant, so there must be something really wrong with him. And these are ideas that might seem a bit bizarre to us today, but they were rooted in the Roman mindset and how they thought about people's behavior. And one of the most fascinating things that I found out is that, a lot of the descriptions in Suetonius, he has this wonderful section, usually at the end of every imperial life, talking about their body and what it means, and the way in which their physical characteristics match with their characters. But they didn't usually match with what people were talking about. You couldn't find, large amounts of gossip about people's corpulence or about, the precise spots that Nero is said to have had, whereas on the other hand, there's so many jokes about baldness. They're just, there's this really cruel sort of, jokes about, that and, what sort of man it makes them, and hair. I wonder if that's because, these are things that are very visible. And so, if you just see the emperor walking by, you can see whether he's thinning on top or whether he's got, hair sticking out of his toga and things like that. So these sort of things, they do pass judgment on their characters. They're not just funny. They're a way of sort of saying, whether they're fit to rule or not. So that they can, just like the sex stories and the idea of the stability of the empire, they can have that sort of serious message.
And kind of those personal attacks, it does raise the question of how does this affect the family? And is there an irony that this was clearly, kind of rumours or not, a relatively fragmented family setup when Augustus is often advocating for somewhat puritanical marital reform?
Yes, and they're all focused on the women of his family. I mean, the idea that there's these stories about him, in his early life when he's Octavian, but then after that, it all becomes about the women, particularly Julia, and the way in which they reflect on Augustus and might undermine him, and so. I think this gives us the sense of when these things stop being about titillation and poking fun at the emperor, because everyone loves to cut leaders down to size, to know well they've got problems too, or they're not, or they're cracked up to be. But, they're also passing judgment on his role as a father, on the family. And it's interesting that, all these sort of ways of gossiping and talking about people are sort of culturally conditioned. And, there are, an emperor is not brought down by being adulterous. So that it's not a problem. It used to be the case that a prime minister or president would have to resign if these things were discovered, but times change as well, and things are accepted in various ways and in different cultures. For example, my research has shown that drawing on other people's research, was that in the French world, love affairs are okay, but corruption and embezzlement, that's really going to bring people down. And so in the Roman world, the fact that the emperor might be committing adultery isn't a problem until it affects the succession. And if there is no clear heir who's going to pass on rule, in a stable fashion, and so you don't have civil war, then that is a problem. So all these things depend on the context.
And we should spend a bit of time kind of considering the vast distances involved within the empire and how that has an effect on the transmission of news, rumour, gossip from those various imperial centres. There would have been so many provinces for whom so much lay at the whim of one man who may never even set foot there. How much of a consideration was that when writing the book?
Yeah, so that's something that I tried to explore, particularly in the last chapter when I sort of brought all these ideas together and considered questions of sort of space and time, because we are in a world without the internet, or TV or even radio, newspapers as you would think about them today. And so I really tried to trace sort of networks. So many of our rumors are in the capitals themselves, Rome and Constantinople. But then I tried to sort of find examples of rumors being spread over distances, or like Cyprian, Bishop of Carthage in the 3rd century. He hears this rumor about Christian persecution. He sends an embassy to Rome to find out if it's true. The embassy comes back. They say it's true. Then he sends this message by letter into the interior of Africa, which I thought was a really great example of how, rumor and its confirmation can travel over space through these kind of networks, and so I try to do these sort of stories with letter letter bearers, because not only do they carry a written letter, they very often carried an oral message with them as well. So being able to trace these, particularly between bishops in the Eastern Empire, was really important. But I should say, there are vast areas of the empire for which I have no evidence, like Britain, for example. That's a big that's a black hole. You know, Sometimes it depends on the chronology. So Spain, not much for the early empire. But then we have Hydatius, this bishop in late antiquity, who hears all these rumors from embassies, and that he records in his chronicle. So suddenly we're able to write about Spain. And so all these things are really culturally conditioned. They're conditioned on the time and our sources. But I think, using the examples we do have, we can show that rumours particularly travelled outside the capitals, wherever emperors happened to be living. Gossip, not so much. Gossip, or at least our sources for gossip, are really placed firmly in the cities. There are some examples outside them, but I couldn't find wide circulation of gossip, which perhaps tells us something about, rumors about, taxes, about warfare, about deaths. They're the things that matter far and wide. Perhaps people in Britain, didn't really care whether the emperor was bald. They never saw him except on the coins. But, the fact that they, may be required to pay, higher taxes because of invasions, that's something that would matter empire-wide.
And the way you dissect those instances of political imposture and kind of the rumoured returns, I think they're some of the most riveting episodes in the books. Are those, like Marius and Drusus the Younger, cropping up later? Are they the byproducts of political crises and discontent concerning the kind of complex succession of those in the purple?
Yeah, no, thanks. I really enjoyed writing that chapter, and I felt it deserved its own chapter, even though some of it's quite speculative. But yeah, that is that changes over time. There's a real concentration in the early empire, and then we don't get the ideas that an emperor was really hiding or escaped death. Again, really until late antiquity, and right towards the end of my period in the 7th century. And I think this is because in the intervening period, usurpation becomes quite common, and that anyone with an army at their back can seize power. They don't necessarily need to pretend to be a member of the ruling family. So there is this sort of big gap, particularly in the 2nd and 3rd centuries, and the 4th century CE, in which we don't have rumors of imperial returns. So, and I think that is because of the dynamics of imperial culture. If you're a senator, you can raise your army, or bring the army you already command and revolt, and then set yourself up anew. Was in the early empire, there's this real attachment to the Julio-Claudian dynasty and everything that they represent, because no one knows what's going to happen after the Julio-Claudians. And we do see that again in sort of late antiquity, when we do get some massacres of family members, and there's rumors that one of them escaped. This is the children of the Emperor Maurice, and that just like the Tsar Nicholas II and his children, the rumors that Anastasia survived the shooting, because it's connected to this idea of hope that the family would continue. And there are I didn't trace them all in the book, but there are quite a few examples of imposters in sort of High Byzantium as well, that sort of cleave to particular patterns. But, the idea that, an emperor didn't die or, escaped from prison, is something that really captures the provincial imagination. These stories don't happen primarily in Rome or any other centers. They're on, very often on the outskirts in the provinces. And so I think this can, connect us to the provincial view a bit more. The idea is that an emperor, you might want an emperor to return because they're a savior, and that they can help you. Again, this idea that the emperor himself is innately good. It's his advisors, the people around him, that might be bad.
And I'm glad you brought up the Romanovs. You don't shy away from drawing comparisons to instances of similar stories from different parts of the globe, Europe beyond, and different eras. When did you feel that understanding about what is said behind a monarch's back in more modern times was necessary to add to the book?
Yeah, so I think it's really about sort of pinning down what was specific in the Roman cases. So I think early when I was working on this book, scholar Simon Corcoran said to me, but what's Roman about these stories? How do they differ from other cultures? And I think that was a really important point, because, we can just say, oh, there's stories in, all monarchical societies about the king being evil or about people returning from the dead. But I think that sort of mandates that we should actually go through these and actually be able to see what is similar and what is different, what is uniquely Roman about these. And I love reading other periods of history. I think that's really a particular fascination of mine. I just happen to work on the Roman world at the moment. But I think, we can talk about, the Romanovs or, Perkin Warbeck, or any of these other sort of stories. But it's the circumstances that produce them. The idea, for example, that if you have a young man or boy, they can be manipulated, for example. Female imposters, in the Roman world, there are female imposters, but not of empresses, because who would want to be a Roman empress if you're a woman? You're just going to be exploited by these horrible men who want power. And so, it's quite different from the story of Anastasia, where she is, a young girl who is rescued and this miraculous escape. That's a story of hope and human survival, where if someone, said, oh, Livia didn't die, I'm Livia, then some awful man is going to try and, take control of her. So I think, thinking about these parallels, it's not just a matter of just sprinkling through the text to make it sound good, but also, to really get to grips with, what is unique about the Roman situation. And, the Roman ones who come back from the dead, like, there's no political program. There's no, real sense of policies or anything like that we get in other monarchical societies, and that tells us it's about the person, rather than any specific initiatives that they might institute. And I do this with various forms of rumours in the last chapter as well. This may look similar to what's happening in China. And yes, we can say this is a cross-cultural rumour, but always the way in which it takes shape is determined by that particular society. And I think that's an important methodological point to make.
And it's pretty hard to know where we are today with the argument of free speech, and let alone back then, when one assumed Romans have an utterly different concept of what it means. But in terms of policing this political talk, you argue that Rome wasn't an authoritarian state in our sense of the word, maybe over the last 100 years.
Yeah, this was quite surprising to me. Again, thinking back to working through Tacitus's annals and all the treason trials and everything like that. World word at the dinner party can have you brought before the Senate for insulting Tiberius, and these kind of things did happen, but they are targeted at the upper classes. They are targeted at the senatorial and equestrian orders. There's no sense that there was sort of like a widespread policing of speech throughout the Roman world, and not compared to all these early modern examples that we find. Elizabethan England, Jacobean England, where people are reporting what people said in ale houses, etc. And I combed through papyri of Egypt, which is the most likely place we would be able to find them in the ancient world, and I didn't find court cases brought for that reason. So and that was quite surprising because I had thought there would be more evidence for restriction of free speech. Also it depends on the emperor. Caracalla, gets criticized. He massacres people. So it does depend on the emperor as well. And but a good emperor is supposed to be able to put up with jibes and jokes and insults. That is a key tenet of what it means to be a good emperor. And many of them abided by that as well. So I think again that sort of ties into the way in which we can think about the behavior of the Roman emperors. And I think so often we're used to seeing Rome reflected through Mussolini's Italy or Nazi Germany, etc., that it's important for us to take a step back and actually see, well, what does the evidence tell us?
And kind of returning to the idea of this being an elusive area of study, is there kind of one uncertain detail from the tales or an area of understanding which you would love to kind of solve or find more clarity?
I would like to know what enslaved people thought. The idea of being able to sort of reconstruct, the people at the real bottom of the Roman social pyramid and how they thought about emperors, beyond the world of the imperial court. For example, we have Epictetus, a freedman, so a former slave. So he tells us about what life is there. But there is a lacuna in enslaved people and also soldiers as well. We really don't have. It again really surprised me. There are some glimpses, but not enough. And I think what soldiers thought, given that they were such a big part of the Roman success story, is a real gap in our evidence. And it may be that I've missed things, and that that people will find that evidence, which would be really fantastic if my book prompts more people to think about ways of reconstructing oral discourse and finds things that I didn't, which I'm sure they will. Then that's really satisfying to me as a historian, that it will sort of prompt further investigations.
And stepping back to look at your academic career, you're a professor at the Australian National University, and I'm just curious to know a bit more about the state of classics down under. Is it in rude health or faltering? I mean, are Latin and Greek taught in many schools, and how are the numbers faring at undergrad level and beyond?
Yeah, so we're doing well. We have a great group of academics across the country at universities. It is a difficult time for the humanities, and fantastic dedicated teachers in schools. Latin and Greek are mainly taught at private schools here, so fee-paying schools, and so there is definitely a privilege built into that study at the school level. Universities that offer Latin and Greek, we all offer it from beginners level. So, never studied anything about the classical world before, no language, don't even know French or German or anything like that, where we start completely from beginners level. but the number of Australian universities that are able to teach full majors in Greek and Latin from beginners to advanced is declining. There's only about 6 of us left, and that is where things are being targeted, unfortunately, because, they have smaller class sizes, which, in these straitened times for the humanities, they don't stack up well against, the business classes, with 400 seats in a lecture theatre. But, I should say, the students we have are really fantastic. We have really dedicated students that take Latin and Greek from beginners level. We teach, ancient history or classical studies in translation at numerous universities, more universities that offer Latin and Greek, and that often encourages students, to think about learning the languages, and our numbers, in ancient history or classical studies are really strong, and that helps to balance out the the lower numbers in the languages. I'm particularly fortunate to work at the Australian National University, which, as the national institution, thinks it's really important to teach a range of languages, both ancient and modern, even if, they don't have, as I said, 300 students. So, in addition to Greek and Latin, we teach Arabic and Persian and Sanskrit and Thai, and, French, German, Spanish, Italian, Indigenous Australian languages as well. So my institution, I'm very lucky, is deeply committed to the languages, and sees it as our duty as the national institution to maintain a diversity of language study. The other element which is really keeping classics thriving in many places in Australia is philanthropy. We have really dedicated and generous donors and supporters who have, endowed positions or created scholarships for students, and, really help to show universities that what we do is valued in the wider community. So their generosity has really paid dividends at many institutions, including my own, where we have entirely philanthropically funded positions.
Good news. Caillan, this has been very enjoyable and at times surprising romp through so many of those colourful characters cropping up in the imperial lineage. So Behind Caesar's Back is published in hardback by our friends at Yale University Press. We'll put the links in the description, so do check it out. Thanks so much for coming on, and we'll look forward to next time.
It was a real pleasure. Thanks for having me.
Thanks so much for listening. Links are in the show notes. Please share with friends and family and keep your eyes peeled for new episodes. And if you want to get in touch, you can through X or email history@aspectsofhistory.com. But until then, thank you and good night.